Serious, 9/11 Megathread, where were you? How has it affected you? Other questions? I was enjoying the life of being a soldier in the US Army. Then war happened and now I am just a rundown disabled vet. That day was tragic and all the events that followed were just as bad. Posted this before, I think. I was working at 222 Broadway. It was my first day in a new group so I wanted to get in earlier. I got on the queue. It was still the express back then, on the Sheepshead base stop. The trains were running like shitty, so they kicked us off at Prospect Park stop and made us wait for the next train. Finally, a bit later than I wanted to, I got out of the train. I think I switched to the N at DeKalb. Can't remember anymore. At Cortlandt Street. Didn't even bother to look at the towers to my left. Made a right by the Marriott, and got my ass to my building. My new bosses were smoking by the entrance. I shot the shitty with them for a few minutes and made my way up. I was on the 9th floor, with my back to the windows facing WTC. I booted up my comp and as I was loading Outlook I felt a massive explosion. The windows shook, as did the building. I ran to the window and saw a bunch of debris floating through the air and birds flying in crazy patterns. I looked down, and didn't see anything. I initially thought that it was a car bomb again. I crouched by my window and looked up, and that's when I saw the giant gaping hole in one of the towers, with flames coming out of it. I sat there for a few minutes, and went back to my desk. The TVs were all on CNBC or CNN and they already found footage and started playing it. I went back to the window and sat there staring at the towers. As I sat there I saw a plane coming, but in my mind I thought that I was still watching TV and that was a replay. I was shaken out of my delusion by the second explosion. That's when the total realization of how dark this was sank in. I sat there for a few minutes looking, until I saw a few people falling or jumping from the towers. I can't remember what I felt, but I got up and started trying to get in touch with family and friends who worked nearby. My parents were on vacation in France, so there was no way to reach them. My grandma who I was living with at the time was working the primary election for NYC, so she wasn't home either. I left a voicemail on the answering machine saying I was leaving the building and I would be home soon. I tried to call a few friends, but by that time most lines were overwhelmed, so it was next to impossible to reach anybody. A good friend was starting her second year in med school in Israel and was supposed to fly out that day. That wasn't happening, so she was home and I managed to reach her. We were on the phone while she was watching the news. It was a live feed, but had a few seconds delay. I felt what I thought was an earthquake, and saw the first tower collapsing. I yelled into the phone, "They are falling," before dropping the receiver and jumping over my cube to get into the stairwell. The whole building was shaking. Everyone went into the lobby and waited around, but no one had any idea of what to do. You couldn't go outside, since the whole street was filled with smoke and dust. It was a very strange feeling of helplessness. Just as that was happening, we felt another earthquake. It was the second tower collapsing. The whole mass of people lost it and panicked. People began screaming and scattering with no real place to go. Somehow I ended up in a second-level sub-basement with about 10 other people. We sat on the floor and just waited. For what? I have no idea. After about 45 minutes a cop in a face mask came downstairs to tell us to stay put. In another 45 minutes the room started filling with smoke and dust because the filtration system was overwhelmed. Some of the women started crying and got panicky again. I decided that it's probably safe to leave. We had a few water bottles with us, so I took off my shirt. I had an undershirt on, soaked it with water, and wrapped it around my face. I suggested to the people in the room that they should probably come with me, and about 6 women came along. I took my little procession out of the building. The air was bad, but not terrible. There was about a half an inch of dust on the ground though. I hate to think what was in that dust. We walked away from WTC towards the bridges. Much of the smoke was blowing towards the Brooklyn Bridge, so I decided that it would probably be best to walk towards the Manhattan Bridge in Chinatown. I separated from my companions a few blocks away when I was pretty sure they were okay and out of danger. I crossed the bridge with a million other people. There were no cars. In the middle of the bridge a couple of fighter jets came overhead and 1,000 people hit the deck. The rest of the story is pretty mundane. I walked for a few hours to get home. I got together with all of my friends later that night. I'm still shocked that I didn't know anyone who was killed personally. The weird conclusions from that day were that I felt no fear, none. Maybe I was in shock, but I had very little emotions throughout the day and the days after. So that's it. Don't know what else to say. I remember it like it was yesterday. My uncle is Kenneth Marino. I was 6, and my uncle was on FDNY Rescue 1, and I was visiting that day. Everyone was sitting down and I was walking around the garage while he showed me what was in what compartments. A few minutes later, I was in the kitchen with everyone else. We all shared a laugh and there was a smile on my face. Next thing you know, there was an earth-shattering boom coming from outside. So everyone decided to head to the roof. When we all got to the top, all I could see was a black cloud coming from the Twin Towers. I didn't know what to say or do. My uncle got down on one knee and told me that my cousin Jimmy was coming to pick me up. Jimmy worked on Engine 1 near Penn Station and he just got off of his shift 5 minutes before Jimmy got to the firehouse. Rescue 1 was called to the site. I never saw Uncle Ken, or anyone else on Rescue 1 since then. Rest in peace Uncle Ken, I miss you. My aunt was on the 40th floor of Tower 2. Yes, she got out okay. Yes, she is now deathly afraid of flying. I was driving to my English class at the Worthington Scranton campus of Penn State University. Upon arriving, the campus had an odd feeling. It wasn't the usual morning bustle. It was quieter because everyone was trying to process the news coming over the radio from our commutes or what was playing on the TVs in the small lounge. Lots of people had cell phones at the time, but they were dumb phones without internet, so while on our feet, we received updates from television and the radio. I had family in Long Island. Everyone was okay, and they knew people who worked in Manhattan. So I called my mother, whom I lived with at the time in PA, to see what was going on. She said she could not get a connection because the lines were overloaded. I drove right back home listening to the story unfold on the radio and then spent the rest of the day attempting to process what I was seeing on TV. From that point on, I noticed that the newscasts tended to repeat scenes over and over again: the planes hitting, the towers falling, etc. And there was more and more info, scrolling text, animated logos, etc. It was an unsettling day for sure. Edit: glancing at this thread makes me realize how young Reddit is, and in particular how few have memories of what it was like to live day to day before 9/11. I was in the army at the time. By the 1st of January I was in Afghanistan. I was in first grade and couldn't understand why everyone's parents were calling them home from school. I asked my teacher why this was happening and I will never forget her response: "It's National Haircut Day." Edit: I did not get a haircut that day. Removed. I watched the whole thing happen from 6th Avenue and Waverly in Manhattan, and then the collapses from Washington Square Park. It was surreal. I remember very clearly watching the first tower collapsing, people screaming, and then there was, what felt like, at least, silence. At that point a crazy homeless person jumped up on the edge of the fountain and started shouting and pointing. "This is what you get. This is what you get." A well-dressed man in a suit walked over, pulled him down and punched him several times, hard. The homeless guy pulled himself free and ran off. Then the second tower collapsed. It looked like a log splitting. More screams. I had a Nextel cell phone for work, and it was working sporadically, so I had a line of about 10-15 people waiting to use it to try to call loved ones. Once that was done, this random guy and I walked over to St. Vincent's to try to donate blood, and there was a line of about 100 people outside. The random guy looked at me and said, "These people are going to need sustenance if they're donating." So we went to the bodega down the block and split the cost of buying every bagel and donut the place had, plus plastic cups and jugs of orange juice. We gave it out to people online, and a little while later a doctor came out of the hospital and told us that they had plenty of blood now, and that we could try other hospitals. I ended up walking home, up 8th Avenue, which they'd closed to traffic for emergency vehicles. It was eerie, because the streets were empty, but the sidewalks were packed. The subways were shut down, so everyone was walking home. Every once in a while a clean bus would race south in the center of 8th Avenue, and then a little while later, A bus would race north carrying evacuee survivors, absolutely covered in ash. When I got home, my lights were on, my cable was working, and the internet was up. It seems so weird that just a couple of miles south of me thousands of people were probably dead. We didn't know how many at the time, and 2 iconic NYC buildings were reduced to rubble. And here I was sitting on my couch watching CNN and surfing the web. I was 11. It was the 4th day of middle school and I was sitting in the corner classroom with a perfect view of the World Trade Centers 3 blocks away. It was maybe the first 10 or 15 minutes of class and our teacher had already assigned us homework. Damn it. I saw the first plane hit through the blinds out of the corner of my eye and everyone rushed to the window. We all felt the building shake and a minute later an announcement is made that there was an explosion in one of the towers but everyone should remain calm. The teacher told everyone to get back to their seats and I'll never forget when he said we should have a moment of silence to calm down. Not a moment of silence for the people who just died in this giant explosion. No, a moment to calm down. When the second plane hit another announcement was made to start evacuations. It was all really calm actually. You'd expect a bunch of kids who hadn't even done a drill in this school yet to be crazy, but everything was going really smoothly. We all gathered in the cafeteria and by now parents were coming in to sign their kids out. I think the school wanted as little liabilities as possible because when my dad came to pick me up he signed out 2 of my friends from elementary school, and would have signed out my neighbor but he insisted his dad was coming for him. The roads were all blocked off by now and it was an adventure leaving the area. We ended up walking up Chambers Street and turning into BMCC because the roads were blocked and that's where the crowd was going. We stopped here for a few minutes and watched the buildings burn and people jump. My dad filmed for maybe 5 minutes. He had gone home and gotten his camera, but it was really depressing. Looking back now, I don't think I realized that the people jumping out of the towers were jumping to their deaths. Once we started walking again, we realized that there wasn't really a way out behind BMCC. We had to jump over a wall fence. A stranger helped me over. I thought that was nice. We kept walking towards home, avoiding roadblocks, trying to talk with policemen to let us through so we could go home. When we reached Leonard and Broadway, we stopped to watch the towers again. This is when people started screaming and the first tower began to collapse. We were reasonably far but we still ran. A man behind me just kept shouting to run and so we kept running for a few blocks until we hit Columbus Park and it didn't look like the debris was near us. By now the police were a bit scattered so we made our way through the barricades and to my apartment. When we got there my neighbor's dad met us at the door asking if my dad took his kid, and he told him no because he wouldn't come. He took off running towards the school. They are both totally fine by the way, but I'm sure it was scary for the both of them but I'm pretty sure my dad felt awful for not making him come with us. I'm not sure how the remaining kids were evacuated. It probably sucked not knowing where their parents were. Then when we all settled, all we could do was turn on the TV and watch the second building collapse. Dust rolled down our empty street and it was eerie. There were no people or cars coming from that direction anymore. I think my dad went out to get water or supplies or something but everything was just a blur after that. I think he was also crazy and went to go see Ground Zero afterwards and he took some soot and put it in a jar. We didn't have school for a while after that because our building was used as some headquarters of something. A few weeks later we got picked up by a school in Chelsea. I also got yelled at by my after-school teacher for not coming in during the downtime which was dumb. The end. This will probably get buried but I've always wanted to share my full story so thanks to anyone who reads this. See. I was in the shower getting ready for work. I remember my mother barged into the bathroom and mumbled something but I had shampoo in my hair and my head under the water so I couldn't quite hear her so I said what and almost without hesitation, and almost never spoken of again. She tore open the shower curtain and told me about the first plane hitting the WTC and that the news was calling it a terrorist attack. When I got out, I didn't bother going into work that day as we just sat there, watching the news. To this day, she remembers yelling for me in the shower but I think blocked out the curtain snatch in the 47 seconds my dongle was in full view. On the 11th of September, 2001, I was sick, around 7 o'clock. When I woke up, I just vomited everywhere. It was pretty epic. You seen that Family Guy episode where they drink the ipecac? It was like that. My mom said I could stay home. The thing about vomiting sometimes, though, is that after you vomit you feel so much better. So after throwing up 3 or 4 times, I was actually okay. Around 8 o'clock, I was feeling good, but my mom still said that I should stay home, just in case. Score. So guess what I did? I jumped on the computer to play me some Diablo 2. You know, grind out a level or 2, and it was fun. So I did that for about an hour. So around 9 o'clock, I jumped into the Diablo 2 chat, hoping to find some people to trade items with. But then something weird happened. Instead of people talking about Diablo, or trading, everything had stopped. Instead, people were spamming the chat with, "Everyone, stop playing, turn on the news, now, and seriously, watch TV right now, get the hell off this game, everyone do it." Looking back, it's kind of a weird thing, but I have a strange appreciation for the gamer community after that because they all put their games aside for a while. Back then, I wasn't sure why everyone was so mad, so I logged off, and turned on the news at 9:02 AM, and for a minute, I watched a news anchor report on what was going on, almost unbelievable at the time, and then I heard him say, "Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we live, on scene, where only minutes ago, a plane." What's that? That's another plane. I was watching it live when the second plane hit. I watched the news for 2 straight hours, till it seemed like things were over, and then I jumped back on Diablo. I played all day. I didn't get up, or take breaks. I just sat there, killing monsters, trying to figure out what I was supposed to be doing with myself. It was the strangest gaming session I've ever had. I was just doing it. It wasn't quite the same, but I noticed something weird after that day, and I'm not the only one who noticed, but people were a little nicer. Immediately after 9/11, I'm a gamer, and as a gamer I run into a lot of racist gamers on the internet, but not the week of 9/11. Gamer courtesy skyrocketed for me after 9/11, and I'm an American, and I run into all kinds of crappy Americans in America, but not the week of 9/11. American pride grew that week. Comedians made jokes about that, too. It seemed like so many musicians were ready to write a song about America that month, just to make money off of 9/11. And so many clothing companies were slapping American flags on all their clothing to take advantage of the demand for American clothes. And I hate to admit, but it really was kind of comical that 9/11 affected people's behavior like that. That racist dude from my history class was suddenly nice to everyone because we were all American. The unity of America in the face of tragedy. It's a beautiful thing, and it's a sad thing, because it took an act of extreme violence for a lot of people living here to realize that we were on the same side. It's 9/11 today, and with mainstream social media being what it is, you're probably going to see about 18,000 more American flags than you probably care about. But enjoy it, because while people don't forget what happened on 9/11, people do forget that we shouldn't be fighting each other. At the time, I was working at a network equipment manufacturer, in the local sales office at 55 Broad Street. My usual trek into the city was NJ Transit from Trenton to Newark, and then path to WTC, up the escalator, through the concourse, out the doors on the corner of 4 WTC by the Borders, across Zuccotti Park, down Broadway, left at Exchange Place, and on over to Broad St. That day, I had an invitation to a meeting at customer that was in the 90s of 1 WTC, what everyone refers to as the North Tower. Meeting was to start at 9 AM. I happened to already have something on the calendar for later that morning, but a good distance away from the city, so I declined the meeting asking to be rescheduled. That meeting never was rescheduled. With a 9 AM start, I would have been downstairs in the lobby at 1 WTC, waiting in line at the visitor's desk to get a pass, then off to the elevators, change elevators at the 78th floor sky lobby, and then the rest of the way up. I had co-workers that were on what we believed was the last PATH train that left the city that morning. The way they tell it, the train pulled into the WTC station, and the place was starting to cloud up with dust. The conductor said that he got notified that something was going on, and he was directed to leave at once, advising passengers to stay on board. That train left, returning to Newark, Another co-worker was stuck in traffic on the Pulaski Skyway, 19 between Newark and Jersey City, headed for the Holland Tunnel, and saw the whole thing happen. Other co-workers were already in the office at 55 Broad Street. They described the sound when the buildings collapsed as deafening, followed by a cloud of dust 25 stories high rolling down Broad St. I was just going about my day working on stuff at home before I needed to leave for my meeting, when at about 8:50, a couple of minutes after the first plane hit 1 WTC, my phone rang. It was a friend who had been watching the news, and wanted to see if I was in the city. I had no idea what had gone on, so I went to the living room and switched on the TV. I was watching live when I saw the second plane hit 2 WTC, aka the South Tower. A friend's mom, who at the time was living in Albany, happened to be in the city that day at a building on John St., just a couple of blocks away. She saw it all happen live from a conference room window on a higher floor. She, like many people, ran north up Broadway. About 9 p.m. that night, she got on an Amtrak train that took her north out of the city. Her husband drove down to pick her up. I, like everyone I know, spent the next several days glued to the TV. I didn't go back into the city for probably 3 weeks. My co-workers and I did some Red Cross volunteer work a couple of times afterward too. I've never come home so filthy in my entire life as those days. The aftermath? For me, it's mostly still pretty vivid in my memory. I'm still a bit weirded out when I'm going straight downtown from home and take the path to WTC. I'm definitely feeling a bit out of sorts today, so I'm keeping myself busy with work, so I don't really dwell on the events of the past. In general, I don't think about the day's events. Lastly, I've never watched any of the documentaries or the movies made about the day's events. I remember leaving a friend's house after seeing about 5 minutes of World Trade Center. I just couldn't do it. Those of you in countries other than the US, what was your and your country's reaction? I was in my house, watching TV and eating cornflakes. I honestly thought it was a prank and I actually shouted bullshit at the TV. I feel horrible. I was in 8th grade. I remember a lot from that day, even that it was a Tuesday. I just remembered before the attacks someone on the radio said, "Hey, it's 911 day, so thank your police and firemen." Got to class and then an hour later our principal gathered everyone into the assembly hall. As calmly as she could she said 2 planes have hit the World Trade Center. Oh, and 1 hit the Pentagon. That Pentagon part stuck with me. Forever I thought that was America's fortress, and to have it attacked and see it on fire was surreal. I seriously thought the world was gonna end that day. I also remembered the world just stopped. Not a sound anywhere except the TV. Never experienced a moment like that ever. When it was all over, everyone was just walking around defeated, heads down and the look of disbelief on their face. I was working in the tallest office tower in Canada on 9/11. I remember returning from breakfast in the basement food court, and walking by the big conference room and seeing it full, with the TV on. Walked in to find out that the first tower was down and the second tower was burning. A big WTF moment. Watched the second tower come down. Started thinking, wow, center of the financial world got hit, and I'm currently in the center of the Canadian financial world. Some other brilliant people must have thought the same thing, because most of the buildings in the downtown core were evacuated a short time later, as a precaution. Of course, the city's local transit systems were completely unprepared for this, and couldn't reschedule the rush hour scheduled earlier. Was stuck in the downtown core for the next 4 hours, as there wasn't any taxis to be had, and the lineups for the limited transit were so huge there was no hope in getting on one. Solution: spent the next 4 hours drinking beer in a downtown bar, watching CNN, got interviewed by a local news crew, and was misquoted, taken out of context on the evening news. Fun times. Edit: reading through this thread sometimes makes me feel like the oldest person on the internet. Warning. Huge story below without use of Tree Fiddy Loch Ness for me. I grew up in the shadow of NYC for most of my life. I lived in Southwest Connecticut right on the NY border. In high school, I used to go to NYC just about every weekend and do all sorts of different touristy things. Lots of people from my town used to commute to NYC on a daily basis to work there, so there were lots of ties for me and my community to NYC at the time. I was just starting my senior year in college at the University of Connecticut, and I was still living in the dorms on campus. The previous night, I had gone out with some friends to the bar and had a fun, but fairly average night. I went to bed drunk and happy, and fell asleep. I woke up in the morning around 9ish, dehydrated from my previous night's activities. It was any other day in college. I got up, grabbed an orange juice from the mini fridge, and sat down at my computer to check my email. My homepage at the time was yahoo.com, so when I opened up my internet browser, the first thing I saw was a news flash about a plane hitting the WTC. I thought that was pretty strange, but thought maybe it was a small Cessna plane that had gotten lost and accidentally, through fog or bad weather, hit the WTC building. I looked outside. Perfectly clear, sunny day, blue skies, warm, and not a cloud in the sky. Strange. I decided to turn on the TV, and switched it over to the news. Right as I turned it to the news, the second plane hit. At first, I wasn't sure if it was a replay of the first hit, but then the announcer stated it was a second plane that hit the second building. Immediately, I thought this is no accident. I ran out into my dorm's hallway, and started yelling for my fellow dorm mates to turn on their TVs, and to switch them over to the news, then ran back into my room to watch this unfold. Several people came into my room to watch, and we just sat there in complete shock. After a while, we started moving around to other rooms, and talking to people about what was happening. I ended up in a room right down the hall from my room, watching it with some other students and some maintenance guys who just happened to be there to fix something up. We were watching and talking until the first tower collapsed. I couldn't help but think that thousands of people had just lost their lives. Nobody said a word. We just sat there staring at the TV, questioning in our heads if this was really happening. Eventually the second tower fell, and then it was over. Shock was the biggest feeling around campus. I left my dorm after a little bit to go to the cafeteria to get some lunch. When I walked outside the building, I couldn't help but think about how beautiful and horrific the day was. Here I was, walking outside on quite possibly the most beautiful day of the year, and this tremendous event had just taken place that had taken thousands of lives. Walking between my dorm and the cafeteria, no one said anything. It was the first time in my life that I knew, however I saw. They were thinking the same exact thing as me. In line at the cafeteria, no one said a word. I found out later that day that a friend of mine had died as a result of the first plane crash. I had grown up with him, and known him since the second grade. He was a year ahead of me. We went to private school and public high school together. He was in the North Tower, working for an investment firm, which was located right in the impact zone of the plane. I assume he died on impact, or at least I want to hope that he did. It took a huge emotional toll on me when it happened, and UConn did a fantastic job of putting events together for the UConn students. It allowed my friends to pull close to me, and I cried like I had never cried before. About a week or so later, Sports Illustrated did an article on my friend. His name was Tyler Ugelin, and he had just recently graduated from Columbia University in NYC and was a student athlete there. Here, http://sportsillustrated.cnn.com/vault/article/mag10237660/ is the article. I read it every 9/11 to honor his memory. I still even have the original magazine that was published stored away somewhere in my basement. The events of 9/11 definitely left its mark on me and my community. I appreciate them because it started to destroy my naivety about the world, and how we, the United States, were doing lots of good, but also some bad in the world. No longer was I US-centric, but looked to develop a better worldview and get out of my little college bubble TLDR. Please read, and I hope you guys enjoy the read for what it is. I was in my 5th grade classroom. Many people were being picked up by their parents and I had no idea why. My teacher didn't say much, and my parents informed me when I got home. I didn't fully understand what was going on until I watched the news. It has not personally affected me, and, thankfully, I do not know anybody who was involved in the attacks, which isn't to say I don't care. Recently I've had the pleasure of working with some 9/11 first responders. They are some of the nicest people I've ever met and I look up to them. I was in someone's closet installing a new light fixture. Had Howard Stern on the radio, so at first I thought it was some kind of sick joke. Then the homeowner called us into the kitchen to see the TV. How has it affected me? Multiple combat tours later, I have a metal spine, plastic knees, and screwed up lungs and a nasty neurotic twitch at even the thought of Australian beef. It was my first day coming to work from our new apartment in Manassas, VA. Since my wife and I were sharing a car at the time, she dropped me off at the VRE Virginia Railway Express station in Manassas, but I missed my train, so I waited a little while, and hopped on an Amtrak train that came through Manassas. I switched to Metro in Alexandria, and had to switch from the yellow to blue lines, and I chose to do so at the Pentagon Metro station. I remember one strange thing that occurred, which was a beach ball, of all things, had found its way onto the tracks. A Metro worker came over, had them turn off the power to the third rail, and hopped down onto the tracks to recover the beach ball. I thought this was a funny little anecdote I'd share with my wife, not knowing what was going on just outside around that time. I finally reached the Foggy Bottom GWU station, and was climbing into a shuttle bus to take me into Georgetown, when the driver asked if we'd heard about the plane flying into the World Trade Center. Almost instantly, someone came over his radio saying they hit the Pentagon, and I looked over in that direction, and saw the giant column of smoke rising from across the river. I made it to my office, where we got nothing done. Everyone just sat around watching the news coverage, and before we even reached lunchtime, the CEO told us to get home to our families. I rode the metro out to Vienna, and it was the weirdest thing ever. The train was absolutely packed, and absolutely silent. I remember seeing a woman wearing a Muslim headscarf and thinking to myself, how awkward she must be feeling right now, with all these people looking at her and thinking, your people did this to us. I finally caught a ride home from my parents. Since my wife was locked down at school, she was her elementary school teacher. I remember seeing an F-15 fighter streaking across the sky as we drove toward my house, listening to the radio. Anyone who's spent time in DC knows that planes coming into land at National Airport follow a very narrow path down the Potomac River, so after they had reopened the skies, it was nerve-wracking to see airplanes coming in low and slow right by my office, located 1 block from the river. I went to high school a few blocks away from the World Trade Center, and 9/11 was actually my first full day of class as a freshman. I wrote more extensively about my experience here. http://airship-daily.com/9112013-was-1/4-years-old-3-blocks-away-from-the-world-trade-center-on-911. But the short version is that we could see the gaping hole in the north tower from the higher floors of the school, and we were evacuated shortly after the first tower fell. We actually exited the building around the time the second tower fell and had to run from a cloud of debris, heading north up the western edge of Manhattan. The subways were down, buses were out, and no cars were being let into Manhattan. So me and 6 or 7 of my classmates walked up to Midtown, where one of us had family friends with an apartment. Thankfully that family fed us, let us call our parents, and housed us until the subway started running again at around 5 o'clock that evening. I think the weirdest thing about the entire experience was that no one ever really spoke about it. Our entire school, not to mention the entire city, had this shared experience that you would assume would be very traumatic, but even though counselors were offered up to us and even though we all ended up becoming close friends, getting stoned and talking about everything, this was one subject that never really came up. At this point, I've probably had more conversations about my experience on 9/11 with people who weren't there than with those who were. I'd like to think we all took it in stride, but my class at Stuyvesant was also, supposedly, one of the worst that the school's ever seen in terms of behavioral issues, drinking, drugs, truancy, etc. So I'm not sure that's true. I was in my junior year AP psychology class. I went to high school in northern VA. The principal came over the intercom and said for kids with parents that work in the Pentagon to come straight to the office. After several kids walked out, we turned on the TV. A few minutes after that, we watched the first tower fall in real time, and then the second. Later we'd find out that one of the girls in our class that day lost her father, who was a retired Air Force colonel in the Pentagon that morning. The day changed my life. It was all a very personal, emotional experience even though my immediate family was not physically affected. I remember driving by the Pentagon en route to a nice dinner on 395 about a month after the attacks for homecoming. I looked over to the right and that gaping hole was still smoking. As overwhelming as the coverage was on TV, seeing it in person was exponentially more painful to observe. I made the decision after 9/11 to apply to military academies because all I wanted to do was serve. I got into West Point, ended up deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm a vet now and looking back at where my life went after that day is a complete whirlwind. It seems like the sentiments on 9/11 are mixed nowadays. Some people are sick of talking about it. Some still cry every time they read the full list of victims during the memorials. I'm part of the latter group. I remember a time where stores like Michael's, and Safeway, and 7-Eleven ran out of many American flags because so many folks wanted so badly to show their patriotism, their solidarity. That time changed me and my life forever. I've lost close friends in wars that were either misguidedly started or led astray. That part sucks. But it doesn't change my generation's investment in protecting this beautiful country. I hope that folks can reflect today and every year that follows about that day 12 years ago. Let yourself be consumed by the sadness and the heartache. Channel it, and let it affect your life and the way you live it. Be kind to people, even in the car, stuck in traffic, when the guy in the left lane once it opens up goes barely the speed limit and prevents you from passing. Even for that guy, be kind. For just as one day every year, try not to be a cynic about all the things you think we're worse off for because of the path we took as a country after the attacks. Take time, instead, to hug your loved ones, remember and think about those who lost theirs, and appreciate the fact that you live in a country, albeit flawed, that is resolved, that is proud, and that is free. My cousin Carol Bouchard was sitting on Flight 11 bound for Las Vegas and a hospital workers conference. She was from Warwick, RI, and had a husband. She was afraid to fly and really didn't want to go. When I found out where the flights were based from, I hoped that I didn't know anyone aboard. Unfortunately, I knew the Bouchard name, and after a phone call with my mother, I heard the worst. To top it off, I was supposed to be in the South Tower at 8 o'clock that morning. A good friend's father got a job at the towers doing maintenance recently and wanted to give us a behind-the-scenes tour of the buildings. On Monday, the 10th of September, he came down with a pretty serious case of food poisoning after eating at a food cart outside the towers. He said that after we met him, he had planned on taking us to the roof of the South Tower and letting us look over an amazing skyline. I know not everyone is religious, but someone was looking over us that day. I was in 6th grade and they didn't tell us about it until right before lunch. I was freaking out because my dad was in NY for a business conference at the time, so I grabbed those spare quarters I stored in my book bag to use the payphone because damn it was 2001 and number 6th grader should have a cell phone. In Idaho, I call home and my sister tells me my dad's office called to say he was fine, so yay for that. I could go back to watching news coverage with everyone else for the rest of the day. What they didn't tell us was that after the first tower was hit, his conference dismissed early, so he walked over to look at the buildings and actually saw the second one get hit. When the towers fell, he was only standing a few blocks away. I swear he's usually smarter than that, and thinking quickly, he hid behind a concrete pillar. After the collapse finished, he was ushered into a nearby 7/11-esque store by a stranger where he was able to clean up and breathe fresh air again. He still has a little bottle filled with the debris he gathered from his clothes that day. None of this seemed like a super big deal to me at the time because I was young and figured he's still alive. No big deal, but years later my mom told me that he was actually planning on visiting the towers later that day because he had never seen them. The whole thing was actually really traumatic for him and he dealt with it through some counseling, but I never noticed anything wrong. Oh, also, a kid in my class heard that my dad was in NY, so he started telling people that my dad was one of the people who had jumped from the towers, so the guidance counselor came and I had to explain that my dad was in fact still alive. Andy, you're DCK. I remember that day well. I was babysitting 2 little girls that I taught in pre-K. Their dad was traveling to Texas and mom was traveling to New York. I woke up and put on my I Love NY shirt. It was the first thing I found while I was packing to stay with the girls, and got the girls ready for school. We walked out to the car and I noticed how silent it was outside. My brother and my dad are pilots, so I always like to look up and listen for planes. I didn't hear anything but didn't think much of it. I got to school and dropped the girls off to their class and went to my classroom. I was called into the office a little while later saying I had a phone call. It was the dad. He was wondering if I had heard from his wife as he could not get a hold of her and if I knew what was going on. I had no idea and we turned on the radio. I told him to keep in touch with me about his wife and if I heard anything I would call him right away. I remember walking back to the classroom with a broken heart. These 5-year-old kids had no worries in the world except what they were getting for snack and no idea their world was about to change. We finally got a call from the mom later that day and everyone on her flight was fine. They were both going to rent a car and come home. We had a bunch of calls that day from parents to see if we were going to explain what was going on. We told the parents it was up to them if they wanted us to talk to their kids. I remember most from that day that I happened to put on that I Love NY shirt and walking outside to silence in the air. I now have a daughter and I hope she never has to feel the pain of having so many people suffer and watching her world change right before her eyes like we did. May we never forget and remember those who need to be remembered, not those who did this to us. Being an Arab Muslim, it hasn't exactly been blowjobs and cupcakes. Fortunately I was only 9 when it happened, so I was spared the brunt of the outrage on account of my classmates not really understanding the implications of the attack. The fact that I get to enjoy the pleasant company of the Tsar even more than everyone else when I travel back to Lebanon for the family reunion every year is just icing. Cross post from the other thread. It was a bizarre day. I was asleep in my van, my home at the time, working as a climbing guide into Olami Meadows in the Yosemite High Country. I woke up to hear every car in the campground seemingly tuned to and blaring the same newscast that was in actuality the same on every station. I think it might have been the emergency broadcasting system, but it sounded really creepy and weird. Then my phone rang with my friend sobbing and asking me, "How did you know?" Because I had been walking around in a daze for 2 weeks telling everybody that WWII was on the way. Backstory. The previous summer I had been on a climbing expedition in Central Asia when my team was kidnapped and held hostage for a week by Islamic rebels before we escaped after grabbing a guy and throwing him off a cliff. Let's just say it was an adventure that will leave you with some things to think about. I didn't even really know what a Muslim was before then. Then I tried to get back to living my life as a professional rock climber but ended up having an even worse expedition the next summer, 2001, in the Arctic. Long story short is that I was struck by rockfall on a very remote mountain under absolutely committed circumstances, summit or death. My partner and I climbed and hiked for 57 hours straight from camp to camp, where I then found myself beached on a glacier, 60 kilometers in the backcountry, with an immobilized leg in an Arctic blizzard. The hike out was traumatic to say the least, and I eventually started to suffer vivid nightmares that were melting into hallucinations. Reality was getting quite strange. By the time I got back to Cali, I suppose I had a decent case of PTSD that had built up over the previous couple of years and probably needed some time out. I woke up that morning to this radio broadcast of the planes hitting the towers. I guess that without television we were all affected a lot differently than everybody else. Of the 40 or 50 people in camp, half were confused and didn't know what to do, and the other half were like, "Big deal, let's go climbing." An older friend mentor pulled me aside and said, "These people are all crazy, let's get out of here," and we took off to go free soloing, climbing unroped, together. It was surreal at this point because you never notice the constant din of airline traffic in the sky until it is suddenly missing, plus standing on mountain peaks and seeing the skies clear of contrails looked absolutely incredible. Never in our lifetime has that happened. Occasionally a couple of jets or a C-130 would fly over, but that was it. Then we got in his car and drove down the east side of the Sierras to his house, listening to the soundtrack from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in silence. It was only when we got to Bishop and saw the television and the reactions of everyone else down there did we start to wrap our heads around it. Everybody was freaking out a little bit. I was at a point in my life where seeing everybody else lose their minds over terrorism wasn't going to be good for my own mental well-being, so I got on the first plane to Thailand about a week later and fell off the map for the next 5 or 6 years. Quit climbing, and left my whole life behind. Have spent the last few years trying to pick up the pieces and get it back together, but no luck yet. Oh well. I was on recruiter's assistance in Albuquerque. I had 1 week at home helping my Air Force recruiter before I shipped off to my first base. I walked into his office, and he looked at me and said, "Go home." I asked why and he just told me to leave. I asked if the government had run out of money or so. Etching. And he asked me if I was watching the news. I told him I wasn't, and he told me what happened. I drove home to my wife and told her what was going on. She started crying. A week later, I arrive at my new base and the place is on total lockdown. I spend the next several months on 12-hour shifts damn near every day. It's a ducking nightmare. I get sent to the Middle East. My wife says, "You are not re-enlisting." I get my degree while still serving, and I get out. It was an intense and life-altering experience for me, but I only got a little taste of it. On the macro level, the resulting wars have seen the death of hundreds of thousands of non-Americans, thousands of Americans, the creation of some of the most insidious anti-terrorist legislation imaginable, legislation which has been turned against its own citizens. We've seen an unparalleled drop in the global opinion of our country, and things just seem to be getting worse. We're effectively involved in what is seen globally as a religious war, and truthfully, it's a war we don't have the will to win. We don't have the will, and they don't have the means. The first side to get both wins the war, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. I fly on a monthly basis, and it's a real pain in my ass. Fuck, let's get energy independent, and stay the duck away from the Middle East. The Russians couldn't win in Afghanistan. The Russians. And they had a bunch of guys like Putin running around doing Putin type shit that told us to stay out. Let's concentrate on our own education, medicine, infrastructure and revitalization for the next 50 years or so. I have a feeling that would do more to reduce the chance of another 9/11 than any bomb we could buy, build, or drop. Recently came to America and was at the laundromat. I thought it was a movie until I got home that evening and realized this actually did happen like 25 miles away. I was blown away because I always had the thought, even before I got here, that America was invincible. I worked in Manhattan on 55th Street and 6th Ave. My team and I work in sales. We were supposed to go to a meeting at American Express at 9 a.m. But it had been cancelled the day before, so we decided to get in early and take advantage of the time to review our meeting and be prepared for the rescheduled meeting that Friday. We all were in a little conference room, and left the room at around 9 a.m. or a little later. I went to my cube and the office was eerily quiet. I heard someone crying. I got up and walked towards the crying, ran into a coworker and said, "What's the matter?" She said, "A plane hit the World Trade Center." I said, "Was it a Cessna?" I remember her stare. Then she said, "No, it's a jet. They've got the TV on. Come look." I followed her, and when we walked into the large conference room, the second plane hit. It was utter confusion. Some people screamed, knowing what it was. Others just thought it was a replay of the first plane. Then the collective conscious realized what had happened and we all got very quiet. About 10 seconds, I think, later, one of my coworkers screamed, "My father. Oh my god, my father. I have to call my father. Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god." I will never forget that. Her father survived. He worked on 30th or so floor of the South Tower. This is when everyone began to go into a sort of zombie mode. I had smoked cigarettes for about 5 years but had quit about a year before. I walked outside of the building and the city was completely still. Not a car driving. People standing around not saying anything. Police and fire vehicles flying down 7th Ave. I bummed a smoke and started walking down 6th Avenue. You could see the very top of WTC. The smoke was unbelievable. I stopped and stood next to a woman. We didn't talk, just smoked our cigarettes. Then the building started to collapse. She screamed the most terrifying scream and collapsed to the ground. Her friend ran to her side and I stared at them. I think it was a few seconds. It felt like hours. I went back to the building and that is when the evacuation began, I think. My co-worker and I gathered our things and started walking towards the Hudson River. We planned to take a ferry to NJ and then walk to somewhere we could be picked up by her husband. This was the beginning of everyone having a cell phone and she was able to get a call to him. When we got the river, the line went for at least several miles. However, a NJ transit bus drove through the line and we were able to use that as cover to cut the line. We got a ferry within 20 minutes and headed to NJ. We landed in Weehawken, NJ and proceeded to walk north along the river. I think we walked about 8 or 10 miles, stopping every mile or so, looking back at the WTC and stared in shock. When her husband picked us up he started the drive to get me home. We were hungry, so we stopped at a McDonald's on the NJ Turnpike. It was open. If anyone has ever been on the NJ Turnpike you will understand this. There was not a single car besides our car going in either direction for miles upon miles. We ate. Then they dropped me off at my friend's house in Berkeley Heights, NJ. My friend lived on the highest point of the town overlooking RT-78. We could see NYC from there. We sat and watched downtown smolder and smoke for hours, crying and in shock. Everyone who was in NYC has nearly their stories mine. The American Express meeting was supposed to happen right across the street from the WTC, at 9 a.m. We would have been exiting the subway around the time the second plane hit. I still, to this day, can remember that experience like it was yesterday. The worst part of it all was I took the train from NJ every day and a woman who took it with me died. Her husband came to the train every day for at least 2 weeks bringing signs showing her picture and information, asking everyone if they had seen her. He left her car in the lot for over a month. Our group of train friends never once talked about it. We would all stand there and stare at the car. I cry thinking about it now. I was on board the USS Enterprise CVN-65. The ship had just left the Persian Gulf a couple days before and was heading to South Africa for some much needed shore leave. The commanding officer of the Enterprise came over the 1MC, ship communication speaker system, and announced that several major US cities were attacked by terrorists. Luckily we still had satellite television. Me and a bunch of friends were able to see the second tower get hit. It was a crazy experience. We couldn't talk to our families back in the US for days. Within an hour of the first tower being hit, the ship was turned around and headed back to the Gulf. We spent the next month just outside of the Gulf. I was glued to the screen from the moment it was announced until it was time to go to work. That was about 12 hours. My family lost 2 people in the attacks. One I had never met, an aunt's wife, but it affected my aunt deeply. She was the love of her life and my aunt vanished for years after, getting little to no help from organizations because they at the time did not recognize homosexual partners and legitimate. Another cousin was waiting for a bus by the buildings. WTC was a big commuter public trans hub. When the first plane hit, she was doused in burning jet fuel, and died a month later in the hospital. I'll never forget the panic I felt that day. I was 15. My dad's job had just moved him to a building next door to the Twin Towers. My aunt worked across the street. When they announced that anybody with family who worked at or near the WTC to go to the office, I wondered what was going on. When I found out, I was terrified. My sister and 5-year-old nephew also lived on Capitol Hill in DC. I called my mom. She told me everyone was okay, which was a blatant lie. She had no idea where anyone was. After school my mom and I went to pick my dad up from the train station, Metro Park. We lived in Central Jersey about 40 minutes out of NYC, and that was a huge commuter stop, Amtrak plus NJ Transit. I had never heard such insane silence in my life. It was all quiet except for the woman who would cry every time a bus or a train would unload people, covered in ash and some had blood on their clothes, and whoever she was waiting for didn't come. I hugged my dad so hard that day. He was a stoic businessman, brought himself up as an orphan from Puerto Rico to a high position at a company downtown. He had few emotions other than anger and the occasional laugh. I'd never seen him cry until we sat and watched the news, and when they'd show people jumping from the towers he started to cry, because he had seen that shit firsthand while he was getting his workers out of their building and away from NY as fast as possible. 9/11 has left a huge impression on my life. I wrote a spiel about it on the 10th anniversary that goes into more detail, as if this isn't already TLDR. http://www.izbytes.net/September-11th-10-year-anniversary/ I was asked to write about this last year for my university's blog. I wrote this, a soldier's recollection as the patriotic music played. I reflected on the past 3 months. With my basic military training officially coming to a close, I had been pushed further and harder than my 18-year-old self could have ever imagined. Tears overwhelmed me while the drill sergeants raised the flag. It felt cheesy, but it was true. I was proud to be an American. The day was the 10th of September, 2001, a year prior. Faced with the impending task of financing my college degree, I decided that the best route would be through military service, specifically the US Army Reserve. My parents were surprised. It seemed completely out of character for me. I wasn't athletic. I had no interest in guns or war. I was in the top 10% of my high school class. I remember mom asking my recruiter what it would take for me to be activated for combat. Something big, he said. Mom and grandma were scheduled to fly to Georgia that infamous Tuesday. They were coming to see me the next day for Family Day, a day family members get to spend with their basic training soldiers before graduation and more specialized training. Their flight was, of course, cancelled in the unprecedented FAA shutdown of US airspace. Dad called off work. They packed the car and drove through the night. In the ensuing years, our nation went to war first in Afghanistan, and then Iraq. Both wars, despite the Taliban's disconnection to the latter, were justified by the events of that Tuesday morning. Though I never ended up serving in Afghanistan, I did eventually spend 2 years of my life in Iraq, 2005 and 2010. I was never angry about being sent away, even in 2010, when I had only been married 6 months. I knew that it was the least that I could do for my country. I knew that it was my duty to serve, even if the cause might be politically unpopular. I left the Army Reserve in August of last year, with 11 years of service. But, if you asked me, I would do it all again. TLDR. I was in Army basic training, 2 days away from graduation. I had been in New York for 2 weeks. I was in my early 20s and it was my first trip to this amazing place. We were sitting on a train, heading to work, when the first plane hit. The man on the PA system said it was an accident and I turned to my girlfriend and told her that was bullshit. I wanted off the train. She, and the other passengers, were dopey-eyed and totally unconcerned. To them, it was just a normal Tuesday. We got off the train and emerged into pandemonium. We still didn't understand what the duck was happening. We got down to a side street and our jaws dropped. The tower was smoking. There were thousands of people in the street and everyone was running toward us. Then the second plane hit and everything after that was kind of a blur. I called home to let people know I was okay. We left her office and walked to Times Square. We couldn't get a train or a cab, because everything was totally shut down. There was almost no traffic. Everyone seemed to be walking. Everyone seemed covered in ash. We spent the night curled up together in a hotel, watching the news. I chain smoked and cried in the bathroom. We stayed up all night and left Manhattan the next day. I was terrified to go back. It was a week before business as usual. The worst part was the people, watching people jumping, and the days after, all the posters, begging for news. Have you seen this man, this woman, this husband, this wife? Have you seen my son? Do you have any information about my daughter? We are missing our dad, our uncle, our grandfather. Photographs of men and women we knew were dead, staring at us from posts in the sides of buildings. The days and weeks passed and the posters got dirty and tattered and watermarked and it just broke your heart to look at them. I know it sounds ducking ridiculous, but if you weren't there, it's hard for you to understand. I felt the air in my lungs and imagined I was breathing their ashes. It would rain and I would feel saturated with their remains. I spent the better part of 10 years feeling haunted and hating the days leading up to the anniversary of this day. This day, the day it happened. So many people, It's so hard to explain how you feel when the horror of it is also overwhelming. The weirdest thing was going out to lunch the next couple of days at work, and not seeing a single airplane in the sky. I live near Los Angeles. There are a half dozen busy airports in the area, and there are always planes in the sky. I worked in and around DC but live in Maryland. I was driving into DC suburb that morning for a 10 o'clock appointment. I had been driving with my CD playing all the way there. I got the news while driving from a cell call from my then boyfriend. I didn't believe him when I heard about New York. I turned on my radio and was listening when I first heard about the second plane. I got to the place in Silver Spring, MD, a short distance to DC, and pulled into the NOAA parking lot, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I was crying terribly at that point. The attendant hadn't heard. He must have thought I was crazy. I went into the building, met my contact, and we went to watch the TVs they have there on the news coverage. We decided it was horrific, and we had better get out of Dodge. They let their non-essential employees go home. I left, and got into the elevator with a woman crying terribly. Her daughter and granddaughter were in the Pentagon, in the area that was crashed. She was shaking, crying. I helped her to her car and begged her to not drive. I pleaded. To this day I don't know if she drove, or what happened to her daughter and grandbaby. It leaves me with a sense of horror. Working in DC after that day has changed the way the entire city acts, walks, etc. It has never been the same. This will probably get lost in the shuffle, but whatever. I was a freshman in college and was at the time going to the local community college and didn't have any classes scheduled on Tuesdays, so I went to bed looking forward to sleeping in. At whatever time the event occurred, my mom comes busting into my room saying a plane just hit the World Trade Center, and in my half-awake state, I dismissed it as an accident and drifted back off to sleep. I had read about a plane flying into the Empire State Building back in like the 40s and I thought this was something similar. Then a short while later my mom comes in again in a panic saying another one just hit the other tower. Get up. Obviously at that point I knew something seriously wrong was happening. So I got up and watched the news coverage with my jaw dropped all morning like everyone else. Saw both towers fall. Heard about the Pentagon and the plane going down in PA. Remember hearing random things about bombs being found on the GW Bridge, planes heading for the Sears Tower in Chicago, etc. Remember for the first time in my life feeling very unsafe living in the US even though I lived in a rural NH town 35 minutes from Boston at the time. Anyways, I worked at Petco and for some reason they were the only retail store that was open in the area that day except the nearby grocery store. As luck would have it, I had to work that day. There was almost no one that came in that day, but one young couple that did come in stood out to me. They wanted to look at hamsters and asked me for help, so I took one out and they were playing with it. When I overheard the girl asking her boyfriend if they could stop by the Borders that was across the street after Petco, I told them that Borders was closed today and in response she started going on a sarcastic rant saying ooh I forgot this is, air quotes, National Tragedy Day. She stopped when she noticed I was giving her a dirty look. Anyways, there are probably 100,000 better 9/11 stories, and people who suffered greatly because of this day, but I can still remember many of the minor details like they were yesterday. It and the only time in my life where during that day I knew I was living in a day that would be remembered by everyone forever. Crazy and terrifying at the same time. That ducking smell 4 weeks after. I lived near Elizabeth, NJ, and that ducking smell of lives lost. That ducking smell in that week of the most beautiful weather ever. I'll never forget that ducking smell and I'm sure I'll never smell it again. For the people that were in New York that day and experienced it directly, how did it unfold for you? What did you do? What do you remember your initial reaction to the news being? Has it affected you at all since? I was preparing to have half of my lung removed due to cancer 2 days later. I remember watching it on TV and thinking the world was about to change in a major way. While I was recovering on the 13th, it was all that was on every single channel, and that combined with copious amounts of morphine resulted in me crying for a few days in the hospital. I'm from the UK and was on a 2-week holiday in Florida with my family at the time. We were at the NASA center when it was happening and we were kicked out because they were shutting it up. A lady who worked there told us there was a security risk and we had to leave. We got the coach back and everyone was talking about it. It was all over the news by the time we got back. My dad watched the news for hours but I didn't after I saw the videos of it falling because I was fairly young, around 8, and wanted to chill in the pool. I could sense that it was a big deal but it didn't have much of an impact on me. We were due to fly home the day after but instead we got to stay in a 5-star hotel all-inclusive for an extra week for free. I was in 4th grade. Everyone was shocked. I was bullied for the rest of the year. At recess I would get the shit kicked out of me because everyone thought I was a terrorist. Everyone would roleplay the US while I was supposedly Osama bin Laden. I told the teacher once and she said that it must have been a misunderstanding. BTW, I'm South Indian. Fucking hate those kids and I hope that they never find happiness. I was in 1st grade in Brooklyn. My class was in the middle of science when my principal came busting through the door saying the rain towers have fallen. She then went to every single classroom to tell them the same information. We were all rushed to the auditorium where our parents were notified to pick us up. Most of us were confused. While my classmates were all picked up I took the longest to leave. I thought my mom would come but instead it was my grandmother who was visibly shaken. We were taking the train home when she told me that mom worked next to the towers and she couldn't contact her. It hit 9:30 that night when the sound of the news on the TV was the only sound in my house besides tears and prayers. My mother then knocked on the door, covered in rubble, dirt, and blood. I hugged her crying and so did my grandma. She said she hid in a diner while the towers fell. She then tried running when the second one was still standing. She had no idea how blood got on her but she said the whole area smelled like death. She had to run across the Brooklyn Bridge to get home and lost her hot along the way. All in all it was terrifying. I'm glad my mom is alive today and the longer version of this story is always good for essays and scholarship forms. Not to sound like I'm milking the story, simply stating how it had affected me. Dad watched it from his office window, purely horrified. I was in 2nd grade, and in music class when they announced what had happened over the intercom. I had no understanding of what had happened. I honestly thought it was a robbery or thief of some sort. I clearly didn't listen well in 2nd grade. I live in MD, and we were all sent to the gymnasium, and parents came in and picked up their kid. I was the only one left at the end of the day, because my mom didn't think that she needed to come get me. I came home, and all of the news stations were airing non-stop coverage. I was 7, we didn't have cable, and I was upset that I didn't get to watch Arthur. My birthday is the 12th of September, and I remember still being upset the next day that none of my favorite cartoons were going to be airing that day. My priorities were clearly in order, and I cringe thinking back on how selfish I must have sounded. I know I didn't know any better, but still. I was at school, starting my day of classes, walked into first period. The news was on. We all watched in terror as the second tower fell. We watched the news the whole day. It affected me by. My aunt worked at the Pentagon as a translator and foreign diplomat. She worked in the section that was it. She was there 20 minutes before it happened. Luckily she had to go check on my cousin across town. If she was there she would have died. The thing I remember the most is the silence while watching the news and the ringing of my aunt's phone. I'll never forget how it felt like it rang forever. My boyfriend is Pakistani. He was born in the US. His parents are immigrants. He refuses to come over and see me on 9/11, as I live in a hick town outside St. Louis and he doesn't want to be shot. Do those of you who are South Asian, Middle Eastern, etc., feel the same way? Have you ever experienced any undue racism on 9/11? I was in 3rd grade when I heard the news. I was shocked, but I didn't understand the true gravity of the situation until I got home and saw my parents' reactions. I live in the NYC area, and was a selfish, do-nothing 20-year-old. It opened my eyes to the world around me. Horrible events. My dad was on the flight. He was very lucky to get a chance to call me before the plane hit. His last words were very powerful and had me in tears. Will never forget them. Needless to say, never saw him again. I was at school in the Midwest. Had no idea what was going on. 9/11 did not impact me in any noticeable way, and I feel like a minority when I say that. Canadian. First week of class in grade 8. Our teacher stopped class, wheeled in a TV. Yes, the TV had wheels in this era, and we watched the news and discussed the events. Then I remember students at lunch saying we were going to go to war. I remember not being able to watch anything on TV for weeks. I learned a lot about George W. Bush that year, and then 9/11 just faded away over the following years, and here we are over 10 years later. My opinion now is the event need to be respectfully remembered, but not busted out to parade around every time it's the 11th of September. No disrespect. Here's some pictures of those who died. http://photos.silive.com/4499/gallery/9/11 divided by 20 victims index HTML0. For those who would rather honor the dead by reflecting on them instead of ourselves.